Hi, I'm the Reverend Lynn Cox. My pronouns are they, them, theirs. And a couple of weeks ago at the congregation I serve, I did a question box, which is to say, people could submit questions to me and I would answer them during the sermon time rather than reading a prepared sermon. And my promise at the time was whatever I couldn't get to in 20 minutes or less, I would return to. So I am returning to the questions that we didn't get to at the question box. And I'm going to redo one of the questions just because I think that the questioner wasn't there to hear the answer. So here's the questions. How did Unitarian Universalism evolve from a branch of Christianity to a non-Christian religion? Obviously, this can't be completely answered in 5 minutes, but maybe you could hit some of the high points. Okay, so Unitarian Universalism was actually two denominations in the United States until 1960. The Unitarians were founded in the 1800s, the Universalists were founded in the 1700s, and they both had previous histories before they got to the United States. So you had the Unitarians and the Universalists. And the Unitarians were one God, no Trinity, and they arrived at this answer through the use of reason. And the use of reason was actually the more important point for the founding of the movement in the United States. And then you had the Universalists, which is universal salvation, no eternal damnation. So the Unitarians and the Universalists were both progressive religious movements in the United States. They were both kind of groundbreaking. They were challenging the orthodoxy of the time, but they were separate streams who kind of ended up in a lot of the same places for a long time. And they started talking about consolidation at least as early as the 1940s, but it didn't end up happening until 1961. So meanwhile, one of the things that happened was the humanist movement, and that started in the 1930s. And if you look at the original Humanist Manifesto, and the Humanist Manifesto was signed by individuals, not institutions. But if you look at the original Humanist Manifesto, you'll find that a whole lot of the original signatories were Unitarian ministers. And also one was a Universalist minister, if I'm not mistaken. So humanism, which could mean atheism, or it could just mean a this world focus, humanism was actually a force in the Unitarian movement starting from that moment. It wasn't the only force, it wasn't the only source of inspiration, but it was a pretty strong current starting in the 1930s. The Universalists, meanwhile, held on to a Christian identity a little bit longer than the Unitarians, but they had also let go of creeds by the time they got around to talking about the consolidation. So in a Universalist congregation, there was no creedal test. You could believe whatever you wanted to believe about God. They were going to talk about God and they were going to talk about Jesus, but it wasn't about belief and it wasn't about adherence to a creed. And because the Universalists stopped requiring adherence to a creed, they got kicked out of the National Council of Churches. So both the Unitarians and the Universalists had a freedom of belief going into the consolidation in 1961. The other thing that happened kind of in the years between World War II and the consolidation is that the Unitarians had started a movement called the Fellowship Movement. And this was an expansion movement. It was a way of supporting lay-led fellowships to start under the American Unitarian Association banner. And these lay-led fellowships didn't have to be humanist. And that is often what happened. So a lot of those fellowships that you'll see having been founded in the 50s and even into the 60s had a very strong humanist current in their congregational culture. And even if those congregations eventually did call ministers, they had a lot of strength of lay leadership, a big ethic of shared leadership, and a lot of focus on this world. So that's kind of the culture that was going into the consolidation in 1961. Now, the original agreement with consolidation included a freedom of belief that was explicit in the consolidation. And it included a freedom that individual congregations could keep doing whatever it was they were doing. So if you had a Universalist congregation that was still worshiping and talking about Jesus a lot, they could keep doing that as a UUA congregation. Or if you had a fellowship that didn't talk about God at all and was very non-theist and low ritual, they could keep doing that. And that freedom was also part of being a member congregation of the Unitarian Universalist Association. Other things that happened then subsequently included the feminist movement. So the Women in Religion was a cohort group starting basically in the 80s. And we have them to thank for a lot of the spirituality and ritual that we kind of take for granted in our UU congregations now. The water ceremony was invented kind of in that context. And then because of the Women in Religion movement, that kind of opened up more space for people who were goddess worshipers, people who were pagans and Wiccans. So that started to be more of a thing in the 80s and into the 90s. And there were curricula like Cakes for the Queen of Heaven that were adult religious education curricula that brought kind of a feminist and earth-centered spirituality into the congregation. And then from there was just kind of an expanding heart for pluralism and an expanding heart for there are lots of different ways that we can make meaning and find purpose. And where we find our center is in covenant making and in love. So we're still figuring out what all of that means as a pluralistic faith, but that's a little bit about how we got here. Okay, the next question. I've always been interested in heretics of all types. Can you talk a little bit about the early UU heretics and who or what influenced them in developing their beliefs, such as rejecting the Trinity? Okay, well, it depends on how early you want to go. That as far back as the Council of Nicaea, you had people who were disagreeing. Like the whole point of the Council of Nicaea was to come up with an orthodoxy. And so going into that council, you had people who were disagreeing. And one of those people was Origen of Alexandria, who did not believe in eternal damnation. But Origen of Alexandria was not trying to start a religious movement. But anyway, different ideas, even after the Council of Nicaea, even after the different churches decided on orthodoxies, there were still always people who were kind of thinking different. I think what this question is getting at is David Ferenc. Actually, no, I think what this question is getting at is Michael Servetus. We'll get back to David Ferenc. So Michael Servetus also was not trying to start a new religious movement. Michael Servetus wrote a book called On the Errors of the Trinity, only he wrote it in Latin. So Michael Servetus was supposed to be studying to be part of the church. So he learned Latin as a young student, and he read the Bible for himself. And he's like, wait a minute, there's no Trinity in here. If only other people were as smart as me, they would see that there's no Trinity in here. And so what he wanted to do was to have the church correct its errors. He wasn't trying to start something new. He wasn't trying to create a religion. He was just trying to call the church back to what was actually in the Bible. And that didn't go well. So Michael Servetus went underground and he gained an assumed identity of a physician called Villeneuve, and he got involved in the printing press and he got involved in research. He wanted to prove that medically it was possible for the Virgin Mary to inhale the Holy Spirit and to have the virgin conception, right? And he wanted to prove that by showing that our respiratory systems are connected to our circulatory systems. And so he did make that connection, and he wanted to do it for a theological reason, but the circulatory and respiratory thing actually is true. So he had a whole career doing that. And then at a certain point, he came out of hiding and he published another treatise. And meanwhile, he had been corresponding with John Calvin, and he got in trouble for this new treatise, and he was arrested, and he was going to be put on trial by the Catholics, and he escaped. And he said, I know, I'll go see my friend John Calvin. John Calvin also not happy to see Michael Servetus. So he got put on trial Michael Servetus got put on trial in Geneva and was burned at the stake by the Protestants. But his ideas were already out there and they continued to be influential. So then you've got David Ferenc in Transylvania, who went through a couple of different religious iterations before he came to a conclusion of being a Unitarian. And the king of Transylvania, King John Sigismund, had a disputation. He had a big conference to get the different religious movements in Transylvania to talk about which one the kingdom should adopt. And what King John Sigismund decided was on the Edict of Toleration, which was all four of the major religions there at the time could continue to worship as they had been doing. And then a little bit later, King John Sigismund decided to become a Unitarian himself, the only Unitarian king that we know of. And then not long after that, the young king was killed in a hunting accident. But Unitarians in Transylvania were already established, so despite the best efforts of the kings that came after him, there remain Unitarian congregations in that region today. So some of those heretics wrote things down, and some other heretics picked them up. And there's a question about to what extent the Unitarians who developed in England in the late 1700s, early 1800s, were reading some of these older materials in other languages, and to what extent they came to the same conclusions independently. I like to think that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and that the Unitarians in England did owe some credit to some previous thinkers. But we're always influenced. And I think one of the things we're learning here is that it helps to know a couple of extra languages so that you can see how other ideas are flowing in other places. So that's just a very little taste, and there's lots of books that I can recommend for you, but I hope that gives you some names to start with. Okay, and then the question that we talked about in the question box service that I'll come back to. About praying, I'm often asked by friends or family, or even guided by my own instincts, to pray for someone who is either ill or going through a very rough time. But I always have trouble praying because I don't believe that there is any life force out there that actually answers prayers. And I don't know who or what I am praying to or why, except to calm myself. Despite this, I usually end up praying that the person find healing of some sort without unnecessary suffering. For some reason, I'm more comfortable saying prayers of gratitude. I know meditation can sometimes substitute for prayer, but saying the loving kindness meditation when someone is hurting or sick doesn't feel the same to me as praying that the individual heal or suffer as little as possible. Thoughts? Okay, so when I talk about prayer and meditation, I put them under an umbrella of contemplative practices. And maybe you can put other things under that umbrella, but those are kind of the two big ones. So often I'll say in a service, let's enter into a time of contemplation, and maybe people have some independence to decide if they're going to pray or meditate. And sometimes we do one and sometimes we do the other. To me, meditation is about awareness. It's about connection with this moment, connection with the forces that create and uphold life. It's more of a going with the flow and less of a petition. And a prayer can be more of an intention, that there's something you want to change. And as the questioner observed, a lot of what we can change actually is ourselves. So if I'm praying for someone's well-being, part of how I think of this is in terms of co-regulation, right? Like if I'm with a kid and the kid is upset, and I invite the kid to breathe with me, or if even I'm just breathing calmly, if I'm being calm while I'm helping that kid find their center, what we're doing is co-regulating, right? We're becoming self-regulated together. And my ability to be grounded as the adult is one of the resources that that kid is able to draw on as the kid finds their own grounding and their own resources for healing and hope and resilience. right? So I think the same thing is true when we're praying with our friends. And the praying with can be long distance, right? We're holding them in prayer. And when we talk to them, we let them know that we've been thinking about them. Or if we're on the phone with them, or if we're present with them and asking them to, if they would like to pray with us, right? That co-regulation, I think, can help someone know that they're being supported, can help them find their sources of resilience, and whatever their body is able to do to support their own well-being, that I think helps their body do those things. I don't know that prayer can cure anything. I don't know about that. And I think that being present with someone is always good if they want that presence. And indeed, it also helps to calm us, and it helps open our awareness to the opportunities that we have to be of practical support. So if I'm praying for peace daily, I'm more likely in my non-prayer life to notice opportunities to advance peace. If I'm praying for someone's well-being, I am more likely to notice opportunities to make them a casserole or give them a ride to the doctor. If I am praying for justice, maybe I'm more likely to notice opportunities to call my congressperson or to show up in public witness. So prayer opens us up, opens our minds and hearts up to the opportunities for other things to do. It focuses our attention, and it also brings an energy into our relationships. So I hope that's helpful. I can't wait to see you all soon, and I'll let you know when the next opportunity is to ask me anything. I'll see you soon.